My name's Sebastian Lay. I work here at the MBL, and I do have the task usually of a couple of housekeeping measures. The first this evening is to just let you know that tonight's lecture and talk is being recorded and live broadcast. So that's you can find that online at mbl.edu after the fact. I think it usually posts about 24 hours later or so. My second task is to ask you to please silence your cell phones. Double check. It happens to the best of us. And my third is to thank the Friends of the MBL for making these Falmouth Forums and Science Before Supper series possible. It's a real service to the community, I think, as you all know, but it wouldn't be possible without all of your generosity and without the efforts of the Friends of the MBL, who really help us connect with the community, help us develop this type of programming, and help raise the resources to make it possible. So thank you to the Friends, and if you would like to consider becoming a friend, please contact somebody after the event. They have name tags on and they'll be in the lobby. And there's some papers in the back. And then finally, my sort of hopefully a rare task of mine is to just note that today is a day of mourning, a national day of mourning. As such, we're going to observe a moment of silence in remembrance of the 41st President of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush. So if you'll join me in just a few moments of silence, please. Thank you. And next, Nipam Patel, who's the relatively new director of the Marine Biological Laboratory, who joined us in September, will welcome tonight's speaker. So please welcome Nipam Patel.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for attending the Falmouth Forum, and I'm thrilled to be the new director of the MBL. My wife and I are settling down here quite nicely, and I'm really so far enjoying the job very much. And I'd like to thank the Friends of the MBL who helped to bring us this great speaker today, Mr. Philbrick, and for all they do to enrich the community here in Woods Hole. And our speaker this evening is Nathaniel Philbrick, and he is an author, sailor, and historical authority on the island of Nantucket. We're also very pleased to welcome his wife, Melissa, who's a Falmouth native. And it's great that she could join us this evening. And I had the pleasure of showing her around the MBL a little bit this afternoon. It was great to learn that her grandfather used to collect specimens at the MBL and help distribute those. And that in 1915, Nathaniel also helped to lecture in a course run by the University of Chicago on the history and economic impact of whaling in this region. It's very appropriate to welcome Nathaniel today on this day when we think about the history of America and the passing of a president. His most recent book, In the Hurricane's Eye, The Genius of George Washington and the Victory at Yorktown, is his third book about the American Revolution. In 2000, Nathaniel was the winner of National Book Award for his maritime history, In the Heart of the Sea, The Tragedy of the Whale Ship Essex, which was made into a movie in 2015 and also inspired TV specials on NBC and PBS. And in 2006, his book Mayflower, Story of Courage, Community, and War was named one of the New York Times 10 best books of the year and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for History. In 2010, he had a bestseller, The Last Stand, and it's currently being adapted for a 10-hour multi-part television series. And he's consulted on a number of other historical shows and documentaries. and his 2013 New York Times bestseller Bunker Hill has been optioned for a feature film and adaptation. His list of works and awards is far too excessive for me to go into, but I can tell you that we're in for a real treat. So please join me in welcoming Nathaniel Philbrick.
Well, thank you. It is a great delight to be here. I have been on book tour since the middle of October. We calculated this was my 27th time I've had the pleasure of speaking before a crowd, and it will be the end of my book tour. So I am so happy to see all of you. And also, it is just a delight to be back in Woods Hole. This is where Melissa and I were married. The bachelor party was at the Captain Kidd. Need I say more? But it's just, so I'm really happy to be here. Well, I never thought I was going to write 3 books about the Revolution. Most of my books are about communities of people, whether it is the crew of a whale ship that's just been rammed by a whale, 102 pilgrims on a ship bound for a coast about which they know nothing, communities of people under enormous stress. And I'm intrigued by what happens to those communities. And initially, what drew me to the Revolution was Melissa and I had lived in the north end of Boston for about a year when our daughter was very young, and I was at home with Jenny quite a bit, and I'd push her stroller through the crooked streets of the North End. And if you want to get a sense of Boston's historic core, that's where you go, particularly the Copp's Hill Graveyard. I was just there yesterday. And I began to think, what was this place like in the Revolution? Well, fast forward to 2010, when I began to research what would become Bunker Hill. We had lived on Nantucket since 1986, an island with a population of between 10 and 15,000. And I can tell you from experience living on Nantucket now for all these years that you may not know everyone, but you recognize everyone. It's a very personal way of living. And Boston, at the time of the Revolution, bore no resemblance to what the city looks like today. It was an island. It was a 1.1 square mile island connected by a thin neck of land to Roxbury. I mean, it was so thin that on a spring high tide, it washed over, and Boston was a literal island. And they had this same population as Nantucket, 15,000. So I thought, well, what was it like to live in a community this size and experience the extraordinary changes associated with the Revolution? And so that's why I set out to write Bunker Hill. And the Battle of Bunker Hill is the obvious climax of that book. But I was unexpectedly fascinated with a gentleman who arrived a few weeks later, none other than George Washington. This was not the George Washington who had stared at me from the $1 bill all my life. This was George in his early 40s, red-haired, fiery, aggressive in temperament, not yet the defensive-minded general he would become later in the war. And he wasn't happy with the New Englanders he had inherited. I don't know about Woods Hole, but on Nantucket, we still have the town meeting. That wonderful example of democracy at its bare-knuckled best, where a group of people stand around, a few notorious characters say with their usual spiel, we argue, and then somehow, miraculously, we come to a decision. And so Washington's soldiers had been schooled in the tradition of the town meeting. And when he would issue an order, they would say, whoa, wait a minute. We are happy to do that as long as we can decide whether we want to do that. And, this attitude just drove Washington crazy. How am I going to fight a long-term war against the British Army, this professional army from one of the most powerful military nations on earth? How am I going to do this? And so he wanted to just get the thing over. By this time, the British had retreated to Boston. They occupied Boston. They were surrounded by the provincial army that occupied Cambridge and Roxbury. And Washington wanted to attack British-occupied Boston, burn it to the ground if necessary, and just finish this thing. It was crazy because he didn't have enough gunpowder. His men would never have lasted attacking the dug-in British professional soldiers in Boston. And every time he brought this before his Council of War, which he did repeatedly, it was voted down unanimously. This was a Washington I needed to follow. And by the way, it was what became known as the Siege of Boston would end anticlimactically from Washington's point of view when a bookseller, God bless independent booksellers, particularly 8 Cousins here in Falmouth, by the name of Henry Knox, who everything he knew about the military he had read in the books in his bookstore. He was sent to Fort Ticonderoga at the southern tip of Lake Champlain, where there were the cannons they needed to somehow get the British out of Boston. He would drag the cannons on huge sleds over the snows of New York and Massachusetts, up and down over the Berkshires into Framingham. And then in March of 1776, a few of those cannons would appear on Dorchester Heights and convince British General William Howe that he had no alternative but to evacuate as gracefully as possible, which occurred on St. Patrick's Day, known also as Evacuation Day in Boston. So that was Bunker Hill. I just decided I had to follow George. Now, but who to pair him with in getting into the next middle years of the Revolution? My mother, Mary Ann Dennis Philbrick, was a born contrarian. She loved to tell you exactly what she thought, especially if she knew you didn't agree with her. She also smoked a pipe, which I have to say, when I was a teenager, my brother and I, it was horrifying when we were at restaurants and my parents would both light up. But her personal hero was Benedict Arnold. And I'd say, Mom, come on. I mean, what do you mean, Benedict Arnold? She said, whoa, she was a big fan of Kenneth Roberts, one of the great historical novelists of all time, who had written a series of books about the Revolution in which he reveals a side of Benedict Arnold that many Americans are unaware. He was our best field general at the beginning of the war. And she said, no, there's more to it than that. And so I am here before you tonight to say Mom was right. And it inspired what would become Valiant Ambition, my next book about the Revolution, which begins in the summer of 1776. The empire is struck back, and now New York is in its sights. Over the course of that summer, Washington's army is dug into New York and the high ground in Brooklyn. He watches as 400 vessels sail into New York Harbor with 40,000 sailors and soldiers. That's more people than in Philadelphia at that point, the largest urban center in North America. What is Washington supposed to do? Well, the Battle of Long Island does not go well. He is completely outgeneraled by William Howe, forced to retreat from Brooklyn across the East River in a brilliant nighttime retreat to New York, but is soon forced to retreat from New York and eventually ends up across New Jersey on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River with most of his army lost to desertion. This is terrible. But what makes it really bad is not only do the British have New York, they have a foothold on the corridor of water that reaches straight north to Albany, and then with a jog to Lake George, and then another jog to Lake Champlain, extends another 100 miles all the way into New York. And this is before multi-lane highways, this is before railroads, this is when the only way to transport anything was by water. And as it so happened, as Washington was losing New York, another large British invasionary force was poised to come down Lake Champlain, take Albany, link up with William Howe, and cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. That would have been the end of the Revolution. There was one American general determined to make sure that didn't happen, and his name was Benedict Arnold. He had a fleet of 15 vessels, and he hid them inside Valcour Island, just below modern Plattsburgh. And the battle he would fight with this huge, relatively huge British invasionary force would be called the Battle of Valcour Island. They would fight to a draw, but it so shook the British that they decided, hey, maybe we should delay our attack on Fort Ticonderoga until the next year. This meant that in the fall of 1776, Benedict Arnold saved America. Valiant Ambition follows Arnold and Washington over the course of the next 4 years as we watch as Washington emerges as the one man capable of holding America together, while Arnold decides that it's his destiny to be the one American officer to turn traitor and try to tear this country apart. It ends in the late summer of 1780 with Arnold's unsuccessful attempt to surrender West Point and its 3,000 American soldiers and ammunition and artillery to the British. Once again, it all comes down to rivers, the Hudson, anyways. And that's how that book ends. Now, I had to then finish this thing. And so in the Hurricanes, I begins of just where Valiant Ambition ends, with Arnold's unsuccessful attempt to surrender West Point to the British. This is the absolute nadir of the war. It's been going on now for 5 years. The American people set into this revolution because they didn't want to pay the British any taxes. Well, apparently they didn't want to pay the taxes required to pay for Washington's army. His army was withering on the vine for a lack of support. Recruitment levels were embarrassingly low. The American people, who had ardently embraced the cause in 1776, had basically turned their backs on this revolution. And Washington had been in a stalemate for more than 2 years, with British General Sir Henry Clinton, who had replaced William Howe, dug into New York with more than 10,000 soldiers. Washington bemoaned, it's as if it's being with a cart with no wheels. This war drags along. Nothing is happening. That summer, American forces had been mauled in the South when Lord Cornwallis, of whom we'll hear more, defeats Horatio Gates at the Battle of Camden in South Carolina, destroying what the remnants of an American force in the South. It's looking really bad, but Washington has some hope. For one thing, that summer, a small French army of 5,000 soldiers with a few warships had come from France and were now in Newport. Unfortunately, the British Navy, the most powerful navy on earth, had immediately set up a blockade, and they were trapped in Newport, had been unable to do anything throughout the summer of 1780 and the fall. This was very frustrating for Washington, because with the French had entered the war in the spring of 1778 after the great American victory at Saratoga, a victory largely engineered by Benedict Arnold. And what Washington realized from the beginning of that alliance was the only way America could win this thing is with the help of the French Navy. He had to establish naval superiority at some part of the American coast if he was going to win this war on land. Up until this point, the British Navy had a stranglehold on the American coast, and they were able to move their soldiers at will in their warships. And there was just really nothing Washington could do. And so what he desperately wanted was a large fleet of French warships to sail up the coast and establish naval superiority at some point. But the problem was, as soon as France entered this colonial rebellion, it became a world war. And we Americans, in our self-centered way, think of the 13 colonies or states, depending on your point of view, as the jewel in the British crown. But that's not the case. The real money was to be made, not in North America, but in the Caribbean. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean, where most of the income of Britain and France came from. Haiti provided a third of what France brought in from away. This was just tremendous wealth. And so as soon as France entered the war, along with its ally Spain, and by the way, they came into this rebellion not to help America. Their primary focus was to take it to Great Britain, because the French had been humiliated in the previous decade during the 7 Years' War, often referred to the French and Indian War in America. The French had lost Canada. Spain, their ally, had lost Florida to the British. And even before that war was over, France had launched a campaign of what they called revenge. And what they realized is the way to get back into this was through their Navy. Their Navy had been completely outclassed by the British, which had the largest and most powerful Navy in the world. And so they set out on a program of retooling the Navy. They created a naval academy in Brest, which still exists. In fact, a professor at the Naval Academy in Brest was a huge help to me in this book. And they applied Enlightenment ideals. They studied naval warfare analytically, creating tactical and strategic guides that were way beyond anything Great Britain had produced. And in fact, British officers were so jealous of this knowledge, they had those guides translated and were greedily reading them. And so as soon as France entered the war in 1778, there were some initial encounters on the English Channel, and it became clear this was a different French Navy. One of the things they had done is created a whole new signaling system. This is before radios and cell phones. This is when an admiral communicated to the captains in his fleet with flags. The Brits used the same system they had used in the previous century. And in fact, each fleet had its own system, so confusion was inevitable. France came up with a very sophisticated numery system that completely outclassed what the British were doing. This was a new French Navy. But much to Washington's frustration, they didn't sail up the North American coast. They were locked in struggles with the British Navy in the Caribbean. First, the British take St. Lucia from the French. The French respond by taking Tobago. On it goes. Washington's, where are they? And by the fall of 1780, he's writing, it's as if a chasm has sprung up between me and the French Navy. And then, in the October of 1780, things begin to happen in the Caribbean. I never thought I would write a book called In the Hurricane's Eye and have it come out in hurricane season. But it did, and we had quite a hurricane season. We got through it all, but the Gulf was just pulverized. But this was nothing compared to what occurred in 1780. The book begins following a British frigate. And first off, I want to give you a thumbnail sketch of naval warfare at this time. I think we have a tendency to think of naval warfare in that time as quaint, tall ships, beautiful things, but, it was from a time long ago. That's not the case. Known as a ship of the line, because what would happen is the two fleets would line up in a line of battle, with sometimes just 50 yards separating them. And what they were trying to do is create a floating version of a fortress and create two fortresses, bring them together, and then just blast away at one another. And, it was huge. I mean, and one of these, by this time it had been determined that the perfect size for a ship of the line was known as a 74, which meant it had 74 cannons on it. These were cannons capable of hurling cannonballs that weighed 20 to up to 30 pounds, more than a mile distance. I mean, just tremendous. One of these ships had more artillery than all of Washington's army at the beginning of the war, so that if one of these ships sailed into a harbor in America, it took everything over. I mean, these were powerful, very sophisticated. It took 2,000 oak trees to build 174. That was 57 acres of forest. Between 500 and 750 men per ship. They could be out there close to a year at a time. And this is without any fossil fuels. They were, if we lost all of our technology, I think we would be hard-pressed to create something as sophisticated as a ship of the line at this time. And so this is what Washington desperately wanted. And so my book begins in October of 1780 with a British frigate. A frigate was smaller than a ship of the line. They were faster, more nimble. They were the eyes and ears of the fleet. And this was the Phoenix. She had been in the Revolution almost from the beginning, and she was scouting out the Caribbean. The Spanish in Cuba were about to send a fleet north to Pensacola to try to take Pensacola back from the British. And so the Phoenix sailed past Havana, then up to Pensacola, and then it was in between Jamaica, British-occupied Jamaica, and Spanish Cuba, when the wind began to build. Now, this is before modern forecasting. This is before Jim Cantore arrives, and you know the weather is going to get worse. And so I focused on a letter written by the first lieutenant of the Phoenix to his mother, describing what would happen next. The wind would build, the hurricane force. They were jibing back and forth in the channel between these two islands at night. I mean, just terrifying. Every stitch of canvas down. Finally, the winds got to the point they had to chop the masts down. The waves hurled the ship stern first into the rocky shore of southern Cuba. The ship, at night, the ship was being pounded to pieces. The men were hanging on to the quarterdeck, just, hoping against hope that they weren't all going to die. And then finally daylight comes. They realize there's only 50 yards between their stern and the rocky coast. They throw out a line. All of them evacuate. Most of them live. It's amazing. When they finally get back to Montego Bay in Jamaica, they learn that all the ships in that bay, when they left, had been lost at sea in this terrible storm. But this is just the beginning. On October 10, what came to be called the Great Storm of 1780 hit the island of Barbados. By the following day, virtually every house, including those built of stone, had been leveled to the ground, and 6,000 inhabitants were dead. Many cannons at Fort James were hurled more than 100 feet through the air. The extraordinary surge of water and wind carried a ship so far onto shore that it landed on top of the island's hospital. The hurricane-whipped rain stripped the trees of bark, indicating that the winds at Barbados must have exceeded 200 miles an hour. The trees were power-washed of bark. A similar scene of destruction occurred at St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and Martinique, where a convoy carrying several thousand French troops was blown out to sea. One estimate puts the total death count of the Great Storm of 1780 at 22,000, making it the deadliest hurricane in recorded history. And then, on October 18th, 2 days after a Spanish fleet of 74 ships bearing 4,000 soldiers under the command of General Don Bernardo de Galvez, for whom Galveston is named, departed from Havana to attack Pensacola, a third hurricane struck. Known today as Solano's hurricane for Jose Solano, the admiral in charge of the fleet, the storm ravaged the Gulf of Mexico for 3 days and ultimately drove the remains of the Spanish fleet back to Cuba. With dozens of vessels sunk and dismasted and hundreds of soldiers and sailors drowned, Solano and Galvez reluctantly decided to postpone the attack until the following year. The lesson was impossible to ignore. Given the seasonal dangers of the storm-battered string of islands, the best place for a navy in the summer and fall was anywhere but the Caribbean. Up until this point, France had viewed a naval expedition to the north on the behalf of the United States as a possibility, but hardly a priority. After that horrendous October, a different attitude prevailed. And thus begins in the hurricane's eye. Washington is there. He's desperate for something to happen. His army in the south, he's stuck in a stalemate to the south. His army has been eviscerated by Cornwallis. He sends one of the great unheralded American generals to do battle with Cornwallis in the Carolinas, Nathaniel Greene, the fighting Quaker from Rhode Island. On Nantucket, we like our fighting Quakers. And he was wonderful. He was the officer when Washington had a question that he was mulling over. He would query all his major generals, and he'd listen to all their opinions, and he'd always do what Nathanael Greene said to do. I mean, he was that reliable and that smart. And he was put in an impossible situation. He had no army really to work with. And it's just wonderful to watch how he dukes it out with Cornwallis, who pursues Greene's ragtag army across North Carolina, chasing them all the way to the Dan River, at which is the border between North Carolina and Virginia. Once in Virginia, Greene is able to build up his army with militiamen until finally the two armies clash on the wooded hillside at Guilford Courthouse, not far from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Cornwallis can claim victory because he is in possession of the field at the end of the fighting, but it is General Greene who has delivered a devastating blow to this British army. The siege at Yorktown will be the great victory that will win us our independence. And we think of Washington as the man behind it, but it begins with Nathanael Greene giving this to Cornwallis. And then, even before this happens, the British send their newest brigadier general, none other than Benedict Arnold, to the Chesapeake. He arrives in early January and quickly proves he was not only the best American general, he's also probably the best British general. He makes his way up the James River with lightning speed. The wartime capital of Virginia has been moved from Williamsburg to Richmond, thinking that it's too far inland for the enemy to attack it. Not Benedict Arnold. He burns Richmond. He sends Governor Thomas Jefferson scurrying for his life. I mean, and this is abhorrent to Washington, needless to say. Not only is the traitor doing this, but it's his home state. And so Washington sends the Lafayette, that great young, in his early 20s French general who's become a kind of surrogate son to Washington. He sends him down to do battle with Benedict Arnold. And so thus begins the movement of troops that in a year's time will ultimately result in the victory at Yorktown. But Washington is desperate to know what is happening with the French Navy. Unfortunately, Rochambeau, based in Newport, has been instructed by his government not to tell Washington where that Navy is, because the French government is fearful that the American war effort is about to collapse, and with absolutely right reason. And if that's the case, they have instructed Admiral deGrasse, who departs from Brest in the winter of 1781, to, if this happens, it will be his job to sail to Newport and evacuate Rochambeau's army from Newport. Can you imagine if that had happened? And so Washington and Rochambeau meet in Wethersfield, not far from Hartford, Connecticut, in May. And they agree that if the French Navy should sometime come north, that they should attack New York rather than the Chesapeake. At this point in the war, it's only in New York are there enough soldiers, more than 10,000 British soldiers, for there to be a potential American victory that could end the war. Because by this time, Cornwallis has moved from the Carolinas into Virginia. He's replaced Benedict Arnold, and he and Lafayette are duking it out. A game of cat and mouse throughout Virginia. And he's moving around. There's just no opportunity for any kind of major victory. So finally, Washington reads in the newspaper that Admiral deGrasse is in the Caribbean. He confronts Rochambeau. So what's going on here? Oh, yes, I meant to tell you. Yes, the French Navy is in the Caribbean. And don't worry, I told them we should go to New York, like you said. Unfortunately, he had told deGrasse, no, go to the Chesapeake. Because their ships were deeper drafted than the British, they feared that the sandbar at the mouth of New York Harbor at Sandy Hook would be a problem. And so the Chesapeake was a safer option. August 14th, Washington receives a letter from deGrasse announcing that he is sailing for the Chesapeake. Washington is outraged. There are two delegates from Congress there who witness his temper tantrum. And they go, whoa. And what amazed me in the year of Yorktown was Washington's emotions. You know, we think of him as this emotionless statue, but the pressures on him are absolutely immense. He knows that if it doesn't happen this year, it's not going to happen. Already that winter, he and Hamilton, his most important aide, have this knockout, drag-out fight at this headquarters on the Hudson. Washington's office was upstairs, and he tells Hamilton, I need to talk to you. And Hamilton says, wait 1 second, I need to go downstairs to get some information to another aide. And by this time, this is when Lafayette's about to head down to do battle with Benedict Arnold, and Lafayette stops Hamilton and excitedly talks to him, and Hamilton says, look, I have to talk to the boss. And he goes up the stairs, and by this time, Washington is waiting for him at the head of the stairs in a towering rage. And he says, you do me a disservice, sir, by making me wait so long. And Hamilton says, if you think, I'm paraphrasing here, if that's what you think, this is the end of this collaboration. And that's it. They part. So thus ends, the great partnership of the Revolution. But Washington could get angry, but he always settled down, always realized what was the best thing to do. And Hamilton assumed he would never have a position worthy in the army after this, but Washington realized how talented he was, and when it came to Yorktown, Hamilton would have the position he deserved. And when it comes to the information he gets about deGrasse, he erupts. 2 hours later, those two delegates come back to Washington's headquarters to have breakfast. It's a completely different Washington. He settled down. He says to them, well, it appears we're not attacking New York. It appears we're going to the Chesapeake. What can you do to help me? He completely shifted gears. He realized he wasn't going to get what he wanted. Now he had to do not what he wanted, but what was the best thing for his country. And so now he has an impossible task before him. He has to march his army. And by this time, Rochambeau and his army have come overland down to New York and combined with the American army. They now need to march overland 500 miles to the Chesapeake, because by this time, Cornwallis has dug into that little town called Yorktown at the end of the point formed by the York and James rivers. It's all beginning to fall into place miraculously. But how is he going to get his army down there? His New Englanders have no interest march down to the Tidewater in August. The killing fevers are notorious. They haven't been paid in years. How is he going to do this? But he does it. He convinces Henry Clinton in New York that they're moving their troops to attack him using Staten Island as the jumping off point. They're in Philadelphia by the time Clinton realizes, oh my gosh, they're not going to attack me. They're going to attack Cornwallis. Washington is at Head of Elk, at the very north of the Chesapeake. He's driven crazy. He has no word of deGrasse. Where is deGrasse? He should have arrived at the Chesapeake weeks ago, if not a month ago. And, what's going on? He gets a dispatch. deGrasse and 28 ships of the line have just sailed into the Chesapeake. He turns his horse around. He rides back to Chester, Pennsylvania, on the Delaware River. He knows that Rochambeau and his entourage of officers have been sailing down the Delaware, inspecting American forts as they go. They look on the waterfront at Chester, and they see a man with a hat in one hand and a handkerchief in the other, jumping up and down like this. And they go, who the heck could that be? That couldn't be Washington. He wouldn't, oh my God, it's Washington. He was so happy. He had to share it with them. Rochambeau disembarks. He and Washington embrace. And I have to say, Washington was not a hugger. And he is just finally, something is seeming to go right after 6 years. On they go. They go to Mount Vernon. He hasn't been home in 6 years, since the beginning of this war. He has 4 grandchildren he's never met. He and Rochambeau roll out the maps on their dining room table and strategize about what they'll do once they get into Virginia. On they go. Washington has gone only a few miles when he gets another dispatch. A large British naval force has arrived off the Chesapeake. deGrasse and his fleet sailed out to do battle. They haven't heard from them in days, and no one knows what's happened. Now, in the history of naval warfare, when the French and British met, the British almost always won. As Washington's aide says, and I'm paraphrasing here, we are very upset, and on they go. Well, what will unfold is known as the Battle of the Chesapeake. We Americans know about Yorktown, but very few of us know about the naval battle that made Yorktown, and I think this phrase is appropriate given the circumstances, a fait accompli. Yorktown was made possible by this naval battle. The French were in the Chesapeake, had Cornwallis surrounded. The British sailed down from New York with the intention of rescuing Cornwallis. If they could defeat the French, it was all over. They would rescue him. They would then sail back to New York. Washington and Rochambeau would be in Virginia. The North would be defenseless. They could take West Point. Washington and Rochambeau would have no one to attack. France would go down in flames. So it all came down to this battle, which has been called, rightly so, I think, the most important naval battle in the history of the world, given its ultimate ramifications. And yet most of us know nothing about it. It was my intention within the Hurricane's Eye to put this battle where it rightfully belongs, at the center of the story. I'm not going to go into the details of the battle because that's why you have to buy the book. But I will say it is an amazing battle. You think it's going to go one way, then the other, and then, anyways, the French prevail. Admiral Graves on the British side is forced to return to New York for repairs to his ships just as Washington and Rochambeau and their armies arrive, and it all clicks into place. I am here before you tonight to tell you that the victory at Yorktown and the genesis of this country was absolutely dependent on a naval battle in which no Americans participated. The beginning of this country depended on our alliances with an international power. Without France, it would never have happened. International relations were absolutely essential to the beginning of this country, and they remain so in the present and into the future. So many times, I wanted Washington to have a high five moment. I mean, Cornwallis surrenders. And, come on, finally have it go right. Well, his stepson, Jacky Custis, Martha's eldest boy, had accompanied Washington to Yorktown. He came down with camp fever. Washington would rush to his bedside after the victory, just as Jacky died. This meant that as the country was celebrating, Washington and Martha were in mourning in Mount Vernon. It would take another 2 years for this revolution finally to end. And in that time, Washington's officers once again dug into the Hudson River area, this time in Newburgh, New York. His officers are getting restless. They want to get paid. The Continental Congress has no interest in paying them and has no ability to pay them because they have no ability to directly tax the American people, and the states are not coming forward. And a few of them more than a few of them, in fact, the majority of them begin to rabble-rouse. And it's proposed that they march on Philadelphia and insist that the Continental Congress pay them at gunpoint. This would have been the military coup that would have destroyed this Republican experiment before it actually became a legitimate country. Washington meets his officers and delivers a brilliant speech before them, and they're completely unmoved. He then takes out a letter and begins to try to read. It's from a delegate to Congress that's sympathetic to the officers. By this time, Washington is 50 years old. He's been having increasing troubles reading the written page. He realizes he needs reading glasses. He's ordered some up. No one's seen them yet. He begins to read this letter, and he's having trouble making out the handwriting. And he looks up and he says, "Excuse me, gentlemen, I have not only gone gray in your service, I am apparently also going blind." Takes out his glasses and he begins to read. Every one of his officers is weeping. And they are putty in his hands. Okay, Washington, we'll do whatever you say. Thus, Washington saves America in March of 1783. It's that November, the British finally leave New York. Washington has a final farewell with a few core group of officers at Fraunce's Tavern, and now makes his way to Annapolis. Why Annapolis? Because the Continental Congress is so fearful that their own army is going to attack them, that they've moved from Philadelphia to Annapolis. This shows you how tentative this government was. This is the barest window dressing of a government. Washington finally arrives in Annapolis, and it's his intention to surrender his military commission to Congress. When George III hears that this is Washington's intention, he tells the American-born painter Benjamin West, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. That is what Washington wants to do. He walks away from ultimate power. He is so nervous when he reads his speech before Congress. His right hand is trembling so violently that he has to hold it with his left. It's December 23rd when he does this. And if you're in Annapolis, the room in which that occurred is still a part of the State House there. And his two aides and his enslaved manservant, Billy Lee, who's been with him every day of the Revolution, ride on to Mount Vernon. They arrive on Christmas Eve. And I have to say, I finished the first draft of this book last year on Christmas Eve. And I have to say it was a different holiday for me. And, I grew up in the 60s when there weren't heroes, there weren't heroes. And I never expected to regard Washington as one of the great heroes of this country, but he is. And what I had come to realize after these 3 books about the Revolution, I'd grown up thinking that the Revolution was linear, that each battle was a stepping stone to God-ordained American victory. It wasn't that way at all. It was more like a hurricane, which I think is the appropriate metaphor for the Revolution. This was a series these were forces beyond any one person's control, swirling things around and threatening to blow apart, except for there was Washington in the hurricane's eye. Thank you very much. I think we have time for some questions, and we have microphones here So
please do wait for the microphones, and I'll start over here, and then there's a couple across.
Good evening. I had the great good fortune to meet you this summer at the Cape Cod Maritime Museum. We talked all things Benedict. I have a question for you regarding Washington, since you seem to have spent more time with him than any of us in this room. Can you at least give us your best guess? What is in his background or in his character that made him the leader that he was, since clearly nobody trained him to be who he was? What's your best guess at what made him who he is? Yeah,
I mean, it's always will ultimately be an enigma, but he had a, in our day and age, we try to get into find our inner core and figure out who we are. He knew who that inner core was, and when he was a teenager, he had an anger management issue. He was really ambitious and had a volatile temper, and he realized he had to control it. And so he realized, that he needed to control who he naturally was, so that he could be a better person, because he ultimately was totally ambitious. I mean, this guy wanted to be the greatest man in America of the world. And to do that, he realized he had to deny his innermost instincts. And so he developed this iron control of his emotions. And he also had a very unusual ability to learn under the most difficult situations a leader has ever experienced. And so, most of us are who we are. And then if things don't go right, we blame everything around us and continue on as who we are. Washington was able to say, whoa, that didn't go right. What did I do wrong, and how do I need to change? In the beginning of the revolution, he realized he could not be the aggressive general he wanted to be. He needed to fight a defensive war if he was going to avoid losing everything. This was completely against his personality. As soon as the French showed up, he realized, I can't do this on my own. It has to be the French Navy. He saw that. When he would become president, he realized, I refer to the genius of George Washington in the subtitle, and he was a genius, very not like Hamilton. Hamilton was brilliant. Hamilton had the ability to take in information from all different kinds of sources, immediately distill it into an eloquent masterpiece of prose. That wasn't Washington. Washington could dial away, had the dial down the static of life, figure out what mattered, focus on that, and follow it with an absolute laser-like intensity. And when he became president, he realized it's all about the Union. It's all this country. If this is going to be a nation, it can't be about each state, each town getting what it wants. It has to be about working together, the Union. What, of course, Lincoln would be fighting for. And so that was Washington's ability to mold himself to suit the times.
Thanks for a terrific talk. The nature of a short summary like this tends to make the story sound as if the communications were quite instant. But of course, it took a long while to communicate across these distances. Can you say something about how the lag time problem in communications affected the way Washington made decisions? I mean, there must have been a lot of complications associated with when he received information, which was at that point a month or two old. How did that work?
Yeah, well, it's to our mind incredible because, we're used to instantaneous communication. They had never experienced instantaneous, this is how their world worked. And what's remarkable is you see how much slower it was. When he needed to get to Newport, it took 3 days from New York. And, everything took time. And just as you said, the communication was very difficult. And one of the reasons why the French succeeded when it came to the Battle of the Chesapeake was communication. Because the naval forces were in the Caribbean, the land forces were in North America. And the way they communicated was with ships. And the French, when it came to their campaign of revanche, had also applied it to shipbuilding and were building the strongest and fastest frigates the world had seen at this point. And they relied on frigates to communicate between the Caribbean and North America. And then every time those frigates made very fast passages and the message got delivered. The British were relying on smaller vessels that were not as fast, and in actually three instances, vital messages would not be delivered because these vessels would be taken by American privateers, lost in a storm, these kinds of things. And so this was, the amazing thing about this year was that no one had their finger on the button. It was all these seemingly random things had to occur in exactly the order they did for it to all to happen. I mean, deGrasse is in what we now call Haiti, about to sail north with its 28 ships of the line, when he realizes he doesn't have the money he needs. And, this is before bank transfers and ATMs. You needed the gold and silver coins if he was going to fund this campaign. So he goes before the planters of Haiti, who were literally the richest men in the world at that time, and says, I need a loan. They had had an earlier bad experience with the French government, and they said no. And then this is where the other unheralded hero of the revolution comes in, a Spaniard by the name of Francisco Saavedra, a emissary the Spanish had sent to the Caribbean to facilitate the workings between the French and the Spanish fleets. And Saavedra is there with deGrasse, and he says, well, why don't you go to Havana? Maybe we could raise the money there. And deGrasse says, come on, you know, what am I going to do? He said, I'll sleep on it. So he sleeps on it, and he says the next morning, okay, it's risky, but let's give it a try. So the French fleet sails to Havana, where in a single day, the citizens of Havana come up with 500,000 pesos, the money deGrasse needs. It's so many, you know, it's tons of gold and silver coins that are divided among the fleet so that if one ship goes down, they don't lose it all. And so the independence of America would not have happened unless, except for a bank loan provided by the citizens of Havana. Anyways, this is the kind of thing, and it's okay, and we get to the theme of communication. When Rochambeau hears that deGrasse has the money, he says to Washington, and that by this time they're in Philadelphia, he says, you know what? You need to pay your army, I'll give you the loan you need. And his men are paid for the first time, and some of them ever, before they reach the Chesapeake. And so, you know, this is how these things were working. And it's a story in which America's fortunes were intertwined with these very complex international alliances.
Sorry, I think we have time for about 2 more, and then we'll adjourn to the lobby. Nathaniel will have time to sign a few books.
Thank you very much. I was remarking on your commentary on the Phoenix, the frigate, as it went through the hurricane, and I was wondering, short of lashing yourself to a mast, how did you get inside the heads of these sailors to depict the experience that they had in such color, and was it through primary sources?
Yes, you know, I write narrative history, and it's only as good as the primary source material. And so this was an instance where, you know, I knew I needed to talk about the hurricanes in the first chapter, because this is really where it all begins. And, you know, but how to deliver it in a way that is involving, you know, and I think, you know, history is, unless it involves you emotionally as well as intellectually, I don't think you get a sense for what it was like to be alive at that point. And so, and in many cases, it will be the sources that will drive my narrative. And in this instance, I came across this incredible letter written by the first lieutenant to his mother about this voyage. And it, you know, I've read a lot of logs and accounts of maritime disasters in my career, and this was one that just snapped in a way I hadn't seen. I said, "Oh my God, this is it. This is how I have to do this." And so, yeah, it's getting when you can find the voice of a person from long ago. You know, it provides you with a chance to sort of go in through a window into a different time. You know, Melissa and I once had a very hairy time in a yawl sailing from Portugal to Madeira, and we were really scared. And, you know, I like to say, yes, I've experienced this. No, I have not even come close to experiencing this. I think it's helpful to have experienced the water in some form, but ultimately it comes down to the documents. And you know, and so as a historian, I am so thankful for those people who did put pen to paper at some point in that distant past. One more?
You spoke of George Washington being brilliant in terms of learning. I understood that a lot of our bland victories were because he learned how to use the Indian way of fighting and not the British way of fighting. Was that true, or is that just hearsay?
It's a little bit of both. What he realized is what he wanted to do. I mean, when it came down to the army he had inherited in Boston area, these were militiamen who many of them experienced Indian fighters, particularly the New Englanders. And, they understood that, if you fought behind trees and stone walls, you could put up a pretty good fight against experienced professional soldiers who would be unable to do the bayonet charge they were used to doing on the plains of Europe. And so Washington understood that. He had been in the French and Indian War and had been frustrated by the British officers' unwillingness to embrace this kind of thing. And it's interesting, there's accounts from family members who describe how he walked, comparing it to a Native American. Just the whole stature he had was deeply affected by his time in what the English described as a wilderness. But on the other side, he wanted to instill a European way of fighting because he saw the military's role. Because remember, this was a revolution, and the great danger was that it would all go from a war between two armies into a civil war. And in fact, it would break into that in parts of Westchester County, and particularly in the South, where violence would just go out of control. He saw the military as a way to control violence. Yes, to fight the British, but also to prevent a civil war from completely consuming America before everything was over. And so, so I think, there's elements of that. I mean, if he was here today, I think he would say he was trying to create a European-style army, but that did not prevent his soldiers from using some of the techniques that they had learned. And hey, before we retire, can I just take a picture of you all? This is my last one, and I just wanted to, let's see here. Wait, can we get that light down? Just, is it possible? No. All right. Well, anyways, you're a lot of you. Oh, yeah. Oh, great. Okay. I'd have to step all the way back. Well, anyways, thank you very much. Hey, yeah. Here, this goes to Elizabeth.